Mecha design and world building. Those are two things that are pretty fascinating and pretty entertaining to dive into. You know, mecha design, that can involve a lot of different disciplines. So you have things like robots and, you know, what we just call mecha. Or here in the West, say mechs. That term actually came from early days in anime and manga over in Japan. This is short for mechanized. And it's simultaneously singular and plural. So you can use it for describing like one thing or sorry, one mecha, or, you know, two mecha. It's a lot of times you'll hear like a plural form of it. I think that comes from maybe possibly European side, because they'll say things like maths. But yeah, whenever you say it, it's just one way of saying it. You know, mecha. It sounds kind of strange, and if you said mechas to someone, but they probably understand what you're saying. And it can apply, really, mecha design applies to anything. It can be, you know, like we said, robots, robotics. It can also be warships, starships, cars, vehicles, really any kind of mechanical machine or anything that's mechanized. And you can even get down to where it applies to like power armor, you know, hard suits, tanks. I think we all like tanks. And there's quite a few mecha designers I think we all like, or at least the ones that we can all think of from different series. Maybe we won't know their names, but we'll definitely recognize their designs and influence they have on the industries. Big influences I had were I was a little too young for Gundam. I mean, it was out, but it wasn't being broadcast over here in the US. But did catch Space Battleship Yamato, which is going to play into the world building later on. It's one of my favorite space operas. Mainly the mecha designs in there, the warships. You know, it's World War II in space. And then Macross, which over here was called Robotech. Macross was a really great influence, because it was the designs of the Valkyries, or, you know, what became known as the Veritex over here. But the Valkyries, those are probably the most influential mecha designs. Especially that, you know, the Gerwak design, or what they call the Guardian. And one specific characteristic of that stands out today would be the canted legs. So canted legs would be something like, say you got the body, you know, body here, you have hips, some hip actuators. And a canted leg, you'll hear people say reverse leg or reverse knee or the chicken walker. But definitely raptor legs, you know, that's what we'd associate that with. But yeah, so this would be a canted leg, or, you know, on an aircraft, say you got a fighter design, and, oof, sorry, these lines are really bad. Let's see, yeah, you have a fighter. And up for the wings. Let's say the wings cant out like, you know, like this. So they're in this direction. And just basically gives you gives a different aesthetic. Also just looks really cool. But in his designs, if you go and look at the Gerwalk or the Guardian, that design of the jets transforming and the legs kicking out into this canted leg form or configuration was really cool and is iconic. And if you look today, even, oh gosh, when it come out, 84? I think it was 84 when it came out. So yeah, 51 years later. It's still iconic, still highly influential for mecha designers today. That transformation sequence in that Gerwalk mode, that got used a lot. Even in Transformers, which I love Transformers. It was another series that came out when I was growing up. What are known as the Secrecy, like the Decepticons like Starscream, Skywarp, Thundercracker. It was after the movie, but there was a sequence where they're flying over a city and they pitch up toward the camera, and then they transformed and their legs kicked out in this canted design. And so that was, I think that might have been a nod to Kawamori-san. He was the mecha designer for Macross. He also worked on a lot of stuff in Gundam and whatnot. And yeah, those shows were, you know, Gundam, Star Blazers, or Star Blazers, Space Battleship Yamato. Let's see, what else came out? Those three definitely were highly influential with mechanical designs and story. They're really building these worlds out that weren't just, you know, animation for kids. I mean, they were in a way, but, you know, characters died in it. They had these epic overarching story arcs that ran throughout the entire series. Yeah, you know, solid character development, and in particular with mecha design, you had this motivation and this focus on oh man, I hope I spelled this right. Forgive my spelling. I think I spelled it wrong. Oops, wrong word. You have this believability scale, right? And still, you know, this still pertains to today. You know, on one end, you've got the rule of cool. This is essentially just, it looks cool, or I think I got a really neat idea in my head, so I'm going to draw it. I'm going to create this cool looking thing, or, you know, machine, or, you know, creature, or whatever. Cool looking city, it can be a starship, you know, whatever you want, cool characters. certain weapon systems, like, you know, in Star Wars you'll have the lightsaber. So that's definitely a rule of cool. Doesn't mean it could be figured out one day and become something real. Oh, you know, very much so. And you see that in history. You'll see a lot of concepts. Take gaming, for instance. You know, in the HUDs in first-person shooters or FPSs, for those of you who don't play FPSs, you have the HUD. And the HUD, usually in an FPS, has become something where you're getting a lot of data, a lot of information. And, you know, so it'd be tracking where the enemy's at, what your objectives are, who your friendlies are with your identify friend or foe, or IFF. And that used to be science fiction, but they're, you know, if you look at what fighter pilots have now with their helmets, the next generation of combat armor for ground forces in the US is going to have that information displayed on there. So that's becoming a reality. Another one that's really interesting is you have what they call, it's like a thermal optic outlining of a human being or a target, but in particular a human being. So I'll give you this solid like orange outline, and it'll be this huge contrast, and you'll basically be able to just, you know, what we call wall hacking, you know, so you can just see this very clear picture of a target in front of you. So, you know, rule of cool has a big place in developing concepts or ideas, especially in science fiction. Star Trek was like that. That did a lot of that. If you go back and watch the original series, there was a lot of rule of cool, and something they call futurist design. And futurist design would be just looking at the theoretical possibilities of what the future might hold when it comes to technology. In the original series of Star Trek, you'd have things like, you know, floppy disks, which became a big thing in the late 80s and the, you know, 90s. And then they had, you know, just computer screens, being able to talk to a computer. You know, we do that now. The communicators back then were essentially the mobile devices that we all use. Yeah, just various stuff like that. It's really cool. So, oh, sorry, I'll get back to this rule of cool. So this believability scale, you'd have rule of cool on one end, and then you'd have ultra realism on the other. Realism is usually, it's either taking things that are in the present day and studying those and then putting them into a series, or it could be theoretical designs, but it'd be grounded with, you know, real technology. And so a lot of these shows that would come up, or a lot with the mecha design, something that was cool about those influential early anime was that they took mecha design seriously, and there was a lot of mixture, like rule of cool. For instance, like in Gundam, you know, you'd have these gigantic mecha, but they would try to make them actually be functional. So in their, you know, the way that they walked, the, you know, the way they were designed with the different actuators or joints, the weapon systems they had, you know, you recognize it like, oh, that looks like a rifle, that looks like a, you know, main battle tanks, you know, gun, main gun. And at the same time that you have that rule of cool, kind of mixed with some realism, in that believability spectrum, they try to put in scenes where you'd have a ground crew, you know, popping open hatches, and working on the internal, you know, mechanics of the mecha. And then especially if you could buy the blueprints, that was another area where they'd really try to push as far to the realism scale as they could. And so you could buy these blueprints, and it was really cool. You get all the internals as much as they speculated. And it wasn't ultra realism, but it was enough to make it believable. You know, so you can do either with Mecha design, which is a lot of fun. And if you just want to do pure rule of cool and you're like, I don't know how this works, I'm not sure how it's powered, it just looks cool, you know, do that and have fun with it. And then, you know, later on, you never know, it could be something like where you get like Star Wars and Star Trek, where the fan base takes it over and says, I want to figure out how to make that work. And that's the cool thing, you know, about this side of the believability scale. I like to sit kind of in the middle, you know. I like things that are hopefully believable enough and are fun to, you know, check out and watch. But yeah, so Mecha can be just about anything, and the way you design it really is, you know, up to you. The first rule of Mecha design, though, is have fun. You know, this, I have no idea what this design is that I'm making here, but it's a lot of fun because I'm just adding things to it. It's a lot of basic geometry right now. And yeah, it just makes it fun just to add things on. Not really sure what it's going to look like afterwards, but this kind of basic geometry, you can just kind of carve the mecha, you know, out of these shapes. Oh, and real quick, world building, you know, having one of the emphasis that they had on those early Mecha series was to have enough believability in what was being designed into the world, so that when people watched it, it really hopefully would help ground the characters, you know. You know, and hopefully convince the audience that, you know, hey, this is, you know, the characters believe in this real, you know, that these machines are realistic and the settings realistic, and so hopefully you'll buy into, you know, the world, you know, being realistic. And you know, that's always important because you're gonna have various people that are gonna be into different series. You know, you take kind of some of the legacy science fiction that, you know, we all grew up on, or, you know, legacy anime and manga, and I think there's something that one of the aspects that attracted us into it was we wanted to see, you know, what are the cool shiny toys that they have, and, you know, what's this starship like, or what is this, you know, what are these hard suits that these guys are, you know, men and women are climbing into, and, you know, what kind of adventures are they going on? And I always liked the machines. That was, I mean, you know, I love characters and whatnot, but seeing the mecha and how they were designed, and, you know, especially robots, but ships, you know, definitely. In the world building part, there's a lot of different aspects to, you know, for your believability. And, you know, you have a thing called, this is what I call it, continuity integrity. And continuity integrity is basically includes things like canon. What are your core concepts, you know? So in other words, those help to anchor and establish the mechanics of that universe. You know, Star Trek, you know, you have, so let's use some simple examples. Star Trek, you have like photon torpedoes. Star Wars, lightsabers. You know, the Rebellion uses X-Wings, the Empire uses, you know, TIE fighters as an example. You know, Macross, you're going to have the Valkyries as one of the transforming mecha that they use, and they're going to be fighting against the Zentradi or Zentrandi, and you know, these are giants that, you know, come with these massive fleets. And they're organic ships, you know, they kind of look like cucumbers almost, but and there are certain rules and certain mechanics that are anchored in that foundation of, you know, what is this series about, and they have to abide by those rules. You know, once you establish the mechanics and you know, and that goes into storytelling and history, character development. And it helps really to keep the creators and the writers and designers accountable and whatnot. One of the things that you take something like Marvel Comics back in the day, they had like 3 bajillion different X-Men books, and one of the problems they run into is you get people in there who weren't concerned about continuity integrity, so you get a character like Wolverine and all of a sudden he's in like 5 different locations on Earth. Sometimes it wasn't on Earth, and so fans would pick up the books and they'd look and like, well, wait a minute, this is taking place like on the same day at this other book. Wolverine's in 2 different places, you know, this character's where they shouldn't be. So it's stuff like that, or, you know, breaking the physics of a universe. But world building is something that, you know, a foundation, it gives you clear boundaries, right? And then, you know, in that foundation, like a building, you have these cores, and these core principles are, you know, what are the characteristics of this universe that I'm building? Well, okay, I've got Mecha, I've got starships, it's World War II in space, or I've just got a bunch of crazy space marines running around, you know, annihilating everything in sight, you know, because heresy. You take something like Godzilla, you know, the big mechanic in that is, traditionally, is Godzilla is a supernatural entity. He can't be destroyed, and he's representative of natural disaster or, you know, punishment sometimes. The recent Godzilla -1 was a great example of that. They went right back to the roots of what that character is, and, you know, Godzilla is also another mechanic in there. Is he's also a reflection of kind of where Japan sits as a society, and as they got more prosperous and became an economic superpower in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Godzilla became more friendly. You know, there's usually a child that he became friends with, and then all of a sudden he was the defender of Japan. But then you get things like, you know, the original Godzilla or Godzilla -1. He's just this force of nature. And, you know, he is on nobody's side. So, you know, here you have I forget the shakiness of my hands. I haven't had coffee. So here you have foundation. And this gives the boundaries of your story. You know, you're going to have your different cores, your core concepts, or, you know, everybody have their different terminology. And then on top of this, you're going to have your architecture, your story architecture. And something unfortunately we've seen today for quite a while is you've got people who come in and they're not building on this core foundation, or, you know, for various reasons. Either they don't care about it, they don't know about it, and they'll start writing essentially fan fiction, and they're trying to attach it onto this architecture, and what ends up happening is you either get damage to the architecture. Sometimes you get damage from the cores because they just want to rip those out, because they essentially they're trying to write their own thing, but they're trying to build it on the backs of the hard work of others who came before them. And so you start building out this architecture, this essentially what's fan fiction, and there's no support. There's nothing here. And this all collapses. And one of the worst things you can have happen is a catastrophic collapse or a cascade failure, and it just, brings all of that down. And that becomes unfortunate. Can you recover things like this? Yeah, you can. You just have to... holy cow, my writing's got bad. You just have to decanonize the fan fiction that's in there, which us as fans, we know what it is. We can identify that pretty well. And then you essentially just reestablish what the cores are, what the foundation is. You can't go outside those boundaries. And here's the cores are, they help you stick to the continuity integrity. So you have your focus, you have your objectives, within the bounds of what you can write in a story, and then you just build that architecture upwards. Now, if you want to expand this foundation, go, hey, we got some new ideas, kind of like the original series of Star Trek going to TNG and then DS9. Actually, DS9 would be a great version of this. DS9 was a darker story, and it's telling this. It really challenged the foundations of the Federation. Said, well, what if they were challenged? What if their ideals were challenged? And how would they confront that? But they built that out responsibly, and they said, okay, we have this new idea, which requires some new core concepts. Does this strengthen the foundation? Does it maintain the continuity integrity? And they found a way to do it, and that answer was yes. So I'm an optimist. I think you can always recover the things that have come crashing down. Is it going to be easy? Is it going to require a lot of hard work? Yeah. But what doesn't require hard work? The other solution to when those things happen is what we're seeing nowadays, is become the solution, right? You see something wrong, start creating your own ideas. Go create the worlds that you want to see built. Expedition 33, which recently just came out, and I think it's Sandbox Studios. Forgive me if I got that wrong. There's a bunch of people. Check out that development story. It was a whole bunch of people who got together, who most of them had never worked in the gaming industry, and they just learned what they needed to learn and created that amazing FRPG, French RPG, which is inspired by JRPGs. And their composer had never worked in the gaming industry, and what happened was the main studio head, he posted on this really obscure forum, very small, and this composer a day later came across that forum, which he'd never visited before, and neither had the CEO head, the studio head, and he saw that ad for a composer, and he said, sure, I'll go try that out. And same thing with their voice actress, one of their voice actresses who was actually being hired for the lead, had never done any voice acting. But as they started discussions, they started talking about the world building, and it dawned on them, on the studio leads, that she should be their lore master. And so she got hired to do some writing. Oh, I apologize. Shaking. So, go out there and do it. Create the world that you want to create. And, some of my favorite authors, and, like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, forefathers of modern fantasy. At least there's an argument for that. They came out of a similar period, a very pessimistic period with their generation. They're post World War I. Their generation almost been annihilated, just across the globe. And when they got back, there was this cynicism because the adults that were supposed to be in charge had not been. They took a generation, threw them into warfare for their own reasons. We see that with culture war today. A lot of the problems that are occurring in the West. So they come out of this, and the attitude then was there's no such thing as a hero. The heroes are dead. The concept of good versus evil is a childish notion. Fairy tales are for children. And fairy tales back then were not like, what we define like today. They were, fairy tales included myth and fantasy, or what would later on become known as fantasy. And, you have these two intellectual professors who are being told by their peers that, grown, mature men and women do not dabble in the fantasy and the childishness of fairy tale and myth. And Tolkien and C.S. Lewis thumbed their noses at that idea. And these are two combat veterans, mind you. And they said, no, we're going to create the worlds we like. And we're going to take all of the elements that we love from all these fairy tales. In some cases, like with Tolkien, Beowulf and the Odyssey, and these really incredible legacy epic myths. And also there's both of those, Tolkien being a Christian, there's also his the Christian beliefs that he had. And Tolkien and Lewis, Lewis later on became a Christian, but they called it true myth. And so they took all those elements. You look at Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, and what do you got? You got dwarves, elves, dragons, and a lot of these elements that hadn't really been combined together, or if they had, it wasn't in some form of like a massively epic universe that you could run around in a universe that was established, had a grounding in history. You look at Middle Earth, and what's great about the movies is they visually illustrated, the characters running around, and you see the ruins of a tower, but then you could go and read in the appendices and find out, oh, that tower has a history. That was built for a reason. And we can do the same thing. All the worlds that we love and the universes that have been burned to the ground, due to irresponsibility or, people who don't care about the accountability of, the continuity, integrity of what they're building. And being, building this foundation, understanding what your universe stands for at the cores, and building that architecture responsibly and being held accountable to the foundation and the core concepts of those universes, so that you can responsibly hold the continuity, integrity together, and not just decide, well, I'm just going to ruin everything. I'm going to stand on the backs of everybody who came before me, or I'm going to ruin this universe that everybody loves because of jealousy. I think there's a lot of petty jealousy that's involved now. You got a lot of essentially fan fiction writers who got hired, and then you got the people who are talented who got ran out of the industries. And really, getting off topic there. Not off topic, wrong description. it's kind of like in high school. You got all the popular kids, and you got all the nerds and the geeks, right? And us nerds and geeks became really popular because we're just accepting everybody, and we just like to have a good time. So they got jealous of that, and because of that petty jealousy, it motivated them to come over and basically steal or work their way into the fandom and under false pretenses, and then they got a hold of the toys and they're like, okay, now I should be the popular one. You should like what I produce. And the fandoms, in some cases, there's been a few elements that here and there that you're like, all right, that's an interesting idea. But then they started going after the fans, being very rude, which you, as an adult, you shouldn't do. Everybody's human, but what they were doing was pretty bad. And then everybody just decided, well, you can stay in your fantasy land and pretend that you care about this IP or this franchise or the worlds that we love. But in some cases, people just said, well, we're going to go over here and build our own thing, and we're not going to wait for the change. We're going to be the change. So sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying if there's a world you love and something you want to build out, or there's a way you think things should be done, start doing it. Start building it out. I've got a universe and a world that I'm building, and I don't know if the Mecha will look anything like this, but it's essentially it's a space opera cyberpunk, and it's going to be a world that includes everything I love. I grew up in a household of just multiple art disciplines. My mom's a pianist. My late father was an artist, musician. We also come from a family of veterans, so 4 generations of the United States Navy. That was a lot of fun. I was a gunner's mate, so you'll see my fixation on weapon systems and weapon platforms, or vehicles, ships, things like that. But a lot of art, and then also science fiction and fantasy. So growing up, it was Battlestar Galactica one night. Star Wars comes out in the movie theaters, this year, and also action. And so we had Saturdays, I think, were Monster Movie. I think it was Monster Movie Saturday, and then Kung Fu Friday. I might be getting those wrong. And then my dad always went out on the weekend, and we'd have B-movie night. So we get pizza, and we would go rent the worst movies ever created, and we just had a good time, And sometimes you found, hey, wait a minute, this B-movie is actually not bad. So whoever finds this, I hope that if there's something you want to see created, because the worlds you love right now are not in the hands of good people. I hope you'll go out there and just start creating and start building out worlds, because we need a lot of good storytellers. And it's going to be hard work, but create that world you have always wanted to see. And don't listen to the haters. They're always going to be around, but you'll find that audience that likes what you're doing, and they want to come along for the journey and see where you're going. And because we need more stories about heroes and villains and good versus evil, and you don't have to defend it. If it's something you love to do, you do it. I wish I had pursued after the stories I wanted to create a lot earlier, because boy, it could help a lot of, encourage a lot of people, inspire a lot of people. But that's why I started now. So get out there and design, and sometimes you want to be a mecha designer, which I hope we can make that into a US thing. There's a lot of independent creators I'd love to work with, and I mean, I definitely got some areas where I got to improve my skills, but everybody, no matter what level they're at, is a student. And first rule of an artist is you're an observer. You observe the world around you, and then you interpret that through your style of art, and your art's your voice. And so it's not so much looking at a building or a planet, potting plant, or chair or tank, and then interpreting that like a one-to-one, ultra realistic view. It's looking at it and going, okay, I recognize those shapes. How would I draw that in my style? And that's what's important. Don't worry about things being lined up or being perfect, or I don't know how to draw people. Just start drawing. Observe people, and you can look at photographs, you can look at videos, you can pause them. What does this look like? Why does this function this way? How do people walk? And just start drawing, making, if you're a writer, in that art discipline, start writing and practicing how to describe things. And yeah, this mecha is like really basic, but it's fun. This is just throwing ideas down. Let's stick a gigantic drum of ammunition on the back, because who doesn't like to have a lot of ammo? Plus, it motivates your enemies to, move. Yeah, and just get out there and create. Don't listen to the crowds. Don't listen to haters. You're gonna have people who are, for whatever reasons, they're just, they just want to get out there and discourage people, and that's too bad. Find the people who are going to encourage you, and you'll find an audience, and just get out there and create. And yeah, it's going to be hard work. You're going to have failures, you're going to have victories, but the important thing is to get back up and keep going. And take a break. Sometimes, you'll draw something, you're like, ugh, this doesn't really work. Take a break and, either write about something or just draw something, scribble, sketch. It's like where you're just kind of sitting down, just mindlessly drawing different things. You're like, oh, I don't know what any of this is. And then eventually, you might draw something, and then you come up with an idea, and next thing you know, you found a solution to your problem that you were trying to figure out earlier. What we need that creativity, and we especially need the things that emphasize those elements about Western culture that we love, That's what's so cool about story, or science fiction especially, is really, really great in fantasy, because you can use those to talk about topics that would otherwise be taboo. Star Trek, the original series, did this, and there's an episode that sticks out. I don't remember the name of it, but the Enterprise Federation gets sent to this planet, and they're in this really, really brutal civil war, and they're about to wipe each other out. And they've never encountered, the Federation's never encountered this race, so the USS Enterprise gets sent over there, and Captain Kirk and Spock and the whole crew are there, and they beam these representatives from the two sides up to the ship, And one race, they're black on the left-hand side of their face and white on the right hand, and the other race, it's the reverse. And what was cool was in that episode, they had twins, I think it was twins, or actors that looked very similar, play these characters. And when they get up there, the crew's kind of stunned, and they're like, why are you guys trying to kill each other? And this is the 1960s, so you had a lot of racial tension back then. And so one of the ambassadors, he says, well, this character, he goes, what do you mean? Isn't it obvious? He's black on that side of his face and white on the other, and I'm black on this side and white on the other. We're opposites, you know, they're inferior, and they're, you know, the crew is just like, why do they want to kill each other? You know, this is ridiculous. And so that was a way to talk about the racial tensions, which you couldn't do directly. But it did in a way that was entertaining and got everybody to think. And that's something else that we're really missing. You know, you got a lot of people who want to just directly fire these things at people or preach at them. And that generally doesn't work. You know, that's kind of, it's not only I mean, sometimes you need to, there are periods where, you know, you need to do, you can do that and just be direct. But the problem with that is you'll anchor that story in that time period, and then it ages out. And eventually what happens is you get generations later who are watching it, and because they weren't there, they don't have the cultural references or understanding of why, you know, this story's being told, or, you know, there's all the nuance there. Sorry, I'm kind of messing it up. But if you tell it in a way that is an entertaining story, and, you know, say it's in a science fiction or fantasy, then it's not anchored. Then what happens is you can watch that decades later, be entertained by that story, and go, oh, I recognize the elements of what they're talking about. I don't have to know anything about the 1960s and the politics, you know, American politics and American cultural tensions that were happening at that time. I know Star Trek, and I know these characters, and this story makes sense to me. So, you know, that's one of the important things about science fiction and fantasy is you can tell those stories and have them, you know, be timeless to a degree. That, you know, and you can watch a cool story. But yeah, this is a short drawing session today. Hopefully whoever comes across this, I hope maybe you've been inspired by some Mecha design, or to go out there and world build. But I'm going to try and it'd be fun to make a career out of this, but I mean, I draw regardless because I love it. I love world building. So yeah, hope everybody has a good day, and yeah, get out there and world build and draw and, you know, geek and nerd out. All right, take care.